Good morning, everybody. It's Alison Coleman here. Welcome to this Schools Forum on the 26th of November 2020. We are once again having a virtual meeting. To anyone who is new to the forum, I know there's some people who it's their first meeting, so welcome to Schools Forum. We are a collective group, all representing different parts of the education sector in Suffolk. One of the really important things is that we all voice what's important to us from the different sectors that we represent, so that all views can be taken into consideration. But when it comes to our decision making, one of the most important things is that we act collectively and that we act in the best interests of all pupils in Suffolk, whether they're in early years or whether they're in post-16 education, whether they're in SEM provision or mainstream provision. That we're here to make decisions that are best for all pupils and that we think of everyone, not just our own settings, when we're coming to collective decisions together. And given that this is one of our major decision-making meetings of the year, it's more important than ever that we just keep that in mind. By way of introduction to the meeting itself, for some people who've just joined the meeting in the last few minutes, I'll just run through some of the things that Kylie had mentioned earlier and Teresa. In terms of the live streaming, it is the main part of the screen that is on view to the public. The information in the meeting chat is only visible to those of us who are within this meeting environment. Also, if you wish to make a point or ask a question, you have two options. You can either request to ask a question in the meeting chat or use the raise your hand function, and I will then invite you to speak at the appropriate time. So if it's in the middle of somebody who is presenting a paper, we can either pause at that point if it's appropriate, or wait until there's a relevant part where we can just pause and take questions. So I hope that's all okay with everyone. Again, I welcome you all. So that concludes that bit of the agenda, and we can move on to apologies for absence. The only one I'm aware of is Amanda Havers. Any other apologies we will put in the minutes for today's meeting. The next part of the agenda, and this might be the last time you hear me speak today, it all depends how this next bit goes, is the election of the chair and vice chair. So I shall hand over to, Adrian, I know I've forgotten a bit. I'll go back just one moment before we go on to the election of chair and vice chair. It's very important to just note, I've said welcome to new members of the forum, but I also wish to note in the minutes our thanks to Helen Wilson from Thurston Community College, who has stepped down from Schools Forum since our last meeting. So I'd just like to note in the minutes our thanks to Helen. And I'm now going to hand over to Adrian, who I think wants to mention something about that as well. And then I'll leave it with Adrian to run the next item on the agenda, which will be the election of the chair and vice chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Adrian Orr, Assistant Director, Education and Learning. Welcome, colleagues. Just before we move on to the agenda item around the election of the chair and the vice chair, just echoing the points that Alison made. Helen Wilson was a long-term member of Forum. She stepped down earlier in the term. Helen made, I think everyone on Forum would agree, a fantastic contribution. And like Alison, it would be great to have that added to the minutes. Our thanks to Helen for all her work on Forum over a good number of years. Moving on to a very important part of the meeting, we need to elect our chair and our vice chair. Forum members that have been member of the Forum for a while will know we do this on an annual basis. We're going to review that, and I'll talk about that in a later item. But for this meeting, I'm looking for if there are any nominations for chair. I believe and understand, Alison, that you're happy to stand again, but I'm putting it to the whole of Forum. Whether there are any other members of Forum that would like to stand as chair, and we can put that into the chat. I see you've got a nomination there, Alison. Thanks, Steve. I'm just checking whether there are any other nominations for chair. I know one or two people. There's been one or two challenges around the internet. We've got a seconder for Alison. I'll hold just for another moment if there are any other members of Forum that would like to stand as chair. I'm not seeing anything else come into the Forum, into the page there. So I'm just going to check. We have one nomination. So we've got one nomination for chair. That's Alison Coleman. We've a number of people nominating and seconding. We haven't set up, I think, Teresa, we weren't, because we didn't know how many nominations there might be. We didn't set up a specific voting item there. But could I see in the chat pane if Forum are supportive of this? It just needs a comment, a yay or nay. I'm seeing a lot of yays there. In fact, they're all yays. So, Alison, congratulations. Well, I'm not sure if congratulations are the right thing. Congratulations, you have been re-elected as the chair of Forum, and I will hand back to you as the chair now in terms of nominations and election for a vice chair.
Thank you, everybody. I'll do my best to keep chairing these meetings as well as I can. In this virtual environment, it's a little bit more challenging than when we're all in the same room, so I hope you'll bear with me when I get a bit flustered, but I will continue to do my best for you all. So please, can I ask, are there any nominations for vice chair, please? It's not that onerous, really, everybody, promise. Adrian, you've got your hand up. Would you like to comment?
I was just going to come in, if I may, Alison. One of the things that we've done at previous meetings is sometimes people want to have a little bit of a reflection about whether they would like to stand as vice chair, and indeed they might like a conversation with you, or they might like a conversation with an LA officer. I see that Alison's come in there offering. What I was going to suggest is we could carry this over to the next meeting, but we have got an offer there of support.
And for those of you who are newer to Forum, Alison has chaired Forum in the past, so Alison is very experienced at this as well. But if people would prefer to defer, then we can, but I'd be happy and supportive of Alison being vice chair, and unless anybody wants to defer. So could you just put some comments whether you'd like to defer or whether you'd like to support Alison? Thank you. Super. We're getting lots of supportive comments coming through, Alison. Looks like you're giving yourself a...
Look, it will be better if we don't defer, so that's looking very positive.
Super. You've got the job, Alison. Thank you. So Alison Bowman is elected as vice chair. Thank you very much. OK, so we can now move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the term of office proposals. And Adrian, you're just going to give us an update, I know, for now, because we've got a paper coming in the next meeting.
Alison, yes, thank you for this, and my apologies. There is a bit of an error on the agenda. People may not have seen a corrected agenda because it says decision on the agenda. It was just an update. Forum members that have been members for a while will know that we looked over a period of time about the election process. And one of the things that we still have to do as a forum is define the term of office period for officers, for forum members other than the chair and the vice chair. And we plan to do, in fact, we started a little bit of work earlier in the year on this, and COVID, frankly, got in the way. So I will be bringing a paper with a set of proposals to Forum at our January meeting for Forum to vote on around what the term of office period should be. It's worth saying, and some of you will be familiar with the Forum guidance. Indeed, one of the things that the Department for Education did during the pandemic, if you're not aware, is they did sneak out some new Schools Forum guidance in May. It's broadly very, very similar to the previous guidance, other than the arrangements for virtual meetings like this. And what that guidance also says is that essentially the decision about the term of office for forum members rests with the local authority, because the local authority is the convening body. However, we would like to do that in a much more collegiate way and bring a set of proposals with some options. They're reasonably well worked out, but they weren't quite ready for this meeting. And this is just an alert to forum members that we'll bring that paper in January and vote on that at that point. So at this stage, I'm very happy to take questions on that, but I'll hand back to you, Alison.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Does anybody have any questions about that before we move on? No. OK, super, lovely. So the next item on the agenda is the minutes of our previous meeting that were held on the 18th of June. So if we could now turn to the paper A, which is the minutes, I would like to take them page by page for accuracy and matters arising, please. So page, if you wish to raise anything, I'll remind you, if you either put a message in the chat or raise your hand, and I'll keep an eye on that screen as I'm running through page by page. So page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. I'm going to, unless anybody puts their hand up and says there's anything they wish to raise before I finish speaking this bit, I will assume that everybody is happy to adopt those as an accurate record of our last meeting. And when I'd looked through, I could see that the actions had either been completed or were going to be raised on the agenda today. Final chance, is there anything anybody would like to raise about the minutes, please? Super, then we will accept those minutes as being an accurate record of our last meeting. Thank you very much. So we can now move on to paper B, which is the approval of the Central School Services Block paper. And I'm going to hand over to Adrian first to introduce this paper. Thank you.
Alison, thank you for that. This is a very important paper, as colleagues will be aware, and I know we've got some questions that came in the last sort of 24 hours, and we can pick some of those up as part of the discussion around this paper. But one of the things I wanted to do just before I hand over to Sonia Harben, who's the author of the paper, was to say two key things. The first thing is a huge thanks to the members of Forum that joined the working group that looked at the complexity that we have to manage around Central School Service Block this year and in the coming years. And I know Sonia met with the group and will say a little bit more about that. The proposals in this paper were developed by the local authority in consultation with that group. The Central School Service Block element of the Dedicated Schools grant is always a slightly complex one, and there are lots of myths around about it. And one of the things I just wanted to say at the beginning was a little bit of context to it. Although we've got a number of new School Forum members, they're very experienced educationalists, and they know about school funding and system funding in education. But they will recall back before 2015, we had something called the Education Support Grant. Now, the Education Support Grant was a block grant that went out to local authorities to pay for essentially the statutory duties that sit with us, predominantly around Section 13A of the 1996 Education Act, the issues about standards in all schools, but also a range of other duties to do with admissions, to do with buildings, to do with how the local authority runs its business. At the same time, multi-academy trusts also got an education support grant. The Education Support Grant was removed at the end of 2015, and what the government did was it reduced the amount of money that went into local authorities as part of austerity and as part of savings, but a block of money called the Central School Services Block was put into the Dedicated Schools Grant to fund those activities of the local authority. It was not quite as much money as sat in the Education Support Grant. It was a reduced amount of money, but in effect, this replaced the Education Support Grant for us. Another element of the Central School Service Block was also the money that schools forums in all parts of the country had historically assigned for particular activities and particular projects. And the Central School Service Block sort of ran as a education support grant replacement for a number of years. However, in the last couple of years, we've been faced with a particular challenge, which is at the heart of this paper. Excuse me looking over here. It's because I've got the screen with all my stuff on over here. People will have heard me say that in other meetings probably. The Central School Service Block is an area that the governments have been reducing in terms of funding coming out into the DSG. And the area they're particularly focused on reducing are those historic commitments. So it retains an element of that, what used to be the Education Support Grant. So we, as a system, you as forum members, we as the local authority have to make some complex decisions about the choices we make in spending that money. Why am I saying all of this? Well, one of the myths sometimes is that the Central School Service Block is somehow a top slice on schools' budgets. It isn't. It is additional money that was added into the Dedicated Schools Grant, but clearly Forum have decision-making powers around how that money is spent, which is why we put a lot of work into consulting on the preparation of this paper. And clearly, you know, colleagues will have seen there's been some debate overnight and some discussions really helpful, really welcome Andrew Berry's questions as a new Forum member, really welcome Louise Spall's questions as a returning member of Schools Forum. So I will stop there and hand over to Sonia, who drafted the paper with colleagues, and she'll give you a slightly more technical, non-context related overview. Sonia, over to you.
Thank you, Adrian. I'd just like to start off by echoing Adrian's words about the support of the working group. We met back when we could meet in buildings back in January, and to agree the initial proposals. And I'd also like to thank Adrian for his eloquent description of the CSSB, which stops me having to go through all that. Like Adrian, I've also got some notes on another screen, so you'll see that I've got my eyes diverted. So just to recap, this is the second year of a 20% reduction to the CSSB funding applied by the DFE. We did work, I met with a working group of School Forum members early this year. That was just me without the officers and heads of services directly responsible for the services, because we didn't feel that was appropriate. We met early this year in January to propose the initial savings for this financial year, and these were unanimously agreed in a virtual vote in May. So the 2021-22 proposed savings follow the precedent that we set in 2021, i.e. they're the full year impact of those agreed last year. And that's because last year we didn't have a lot of time in which between the announcement of the 20% reduction and having to implement them. So the working group felt it was an appropriate thing to do to not pull the full amount of funding in 2021, but that the final third would be the first call of savings required in 21-22. The majority of the other savings that we're making, which are not the full year impact of savings already agreed, being made by utilising the additional high needs block budget we've got to cover, because those costs can be met this way under the DSG guidance, and it will only have a marginal impact overall on the high needs block budget available in 21-22, as there's currently no 0.5% transfer being suggested to offset some of the current DSG deficit from the high needs block, as there was in 2021. So the impact is there's very little impact difference between that 0.5% we agreed and the funding that will be transferred to the high needs block. And what that does is that maintains those services, so there's no discussion required on reducing those. I do think it's important to raise with Schools Forum some of the key comments that the working group fed back alongside agreeing these proposed savings for 21-22 in this paper. And these included asking if the remaining services, so those that are at the moment not up or being recommended as a saving in 21-22, if they're already looking at how they can potentially trade in future, and also ensuring, and I am going to credit Angela Ransby for these, that we're targeting our resources to those made most vulnerable, so they're all fully protected. So they're just some of the comments that I had back when we were doing this paper. I think it's important to also say that the savings, the 20% savings for 22-23 will no doubt be more difficult to achieve without impacting directly on the most vulnerable, and the services that schools have come to expect that are provided by the LA. The saving requirement in 2022-23 is going to be 847,000. And coming back to the discussion about trading, I know Education and Learning in particular are looking at the implications and how they could meet some of this saving. And as a DMT, the local authority, we're planning to review those and see how those plans could be used within the virtual school and early help service, which will be the two main services left that are funded partially through the CSSB, to see how they can mitigate savings in future years and ensure continuity of current services. And unfortunately, this time last year, we were assuming that we would have a comprehensive spending review, we'd have had a 3-year settlement, which would allow the corporate leadership team to take a favourable view on covering at least a proportion, if not all, of the CSSB loss from corporate resources. As everybody knows, we're now in a very different position. We had a one-year settlement yesterday, the headlines of which were announced yesterday, and we're just working through those details, what that means in terms of our sort of plans that we've currently got in our medium-term financial plan. Well, what we do know is that the capacity of the local authority to fund any kind of budget pressure has been diminished. So just want to reassure you all, I am showing the loss of the CSSB as a cost pressure in our medium-term financial plan, but my confidence levels of there'll be central resources to match the loss are a lot lower than they were this time last year, given the overall burden on the public purse and other obviously statutory responsibilities we've got, particularly within the adult sector and children. Well, I will continue to work with the working group to get options for 2022, 23 and beyond, and I'll start that process as soon as possible early in the next year. And by that time we'll have a clearer picture, hopefully, of future funding. Even though the headlines were announced yesterday, the actual, what that means for local authorities individually, we don't get that information till literally about 2 days before Christmas. So we're still not sure of actual what it means for the savings. We've already identified core. Our other issue we've got for early help, which in good news, troubled families funding is continuing in 21-22, but again we've only been given a one-year settlement, so there's £1 million potential loss there from 2022-23. I'd just like to sort of finally add, the DfE guidance means that even if the savings are agreed, the remaining commitments have to be agreed by schools forum on a line-by-line basis, and that's why you'll have seen there are a number of votes required for this paper. We do have representatives from each of the services available to answer any questions regarding service delivery and the impact that reducing these budgets will have. So other than that, and I'm assuming everybody has read the paper, I'm quite happy now to hand over to see if anybody's got any questions, either that I can answer or we can hand over to service representatives.
Okay, thank you. I can see there's a hand up, and the trouble is because there's so many people on my screen, I can't see whose hand it is.
It's Andrew Berry's hand, Alison.
Thank you. I've now put myself on a different screen so I can see that. Over to you, Andrew. If you'd like to put on your video and your microphone and just introduce yourself before you speak. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Andrew Berry. I'm CEO of the Chilean Partnership and new to Schools Forum, so apologies if I'm not asking the right questions or following the right protocol, but please shut me down if I'm not. My first question is regarding paper B, and it's about the paragraph 15 and paragraph 19. And the first question I have is with regards to the landlord duty, which seems to be continuing in 2021, but then going to zero in 21-22. I don't understand what landlord duty covers, but a layman's approach would be that it covers a significant amount of health and safety. So if that is about health and safety in schools, how is that going to be covered by the local authority?
If I come in on this one initially, I don't think we've got a representative from property here, Sonia, have we? No,
you're right. I think it's, yeah, sorry, I'll just say that they're working on that expectation. This isn't going to be agreed because it was already agreed by Forum last year to reduce. So no, there's no representative here.
No, so it's a really good question, Andrew, and not surprisingly, it's one that has sort of taxed us and taxed Forum over a period of time. Essentially, it's a line that sits in. It sits as part of the CSSB. It was part of the former education support grant requirements. You're absolutely right. It's health and safety, but it's the really big ticket stuff around. Let me give an example that they used at a previous forum when they did attend was, although for example, an academy school, in effect, has to run a whole range of its own health and safety arrangements. If there was a major catastrophe with the building, so for example, there's a collapse to do with foundations or something like that, Suffolk County Council is still the landlord. There is a lease to the Department for Education. So things like, it's almost an insurance policy around things of that nature. However, we had representatives, and I don't want to sort of talk for them, but we had representatives from property at previous forum, and I see Darren's coming in now. I'll invite Darren in a moment. The previous forum came to a view that actually this wasn't something that we would continue to fund. Is that right? Is that right, Sonia? Is
yeah,
my recollection
no, you're right. And actually, we still have a statutory duty as a local authority to provide that service. The issue was the level of service, what they would apply. So they still have to maintain their statutory duties. They just won't be funded to do that from this block of funding. But I'm sure we can get somebody from property to answer or give a summary of exactly what it is they still provide. I think that's my understanding.
Yeah. But I think going back to Andrew's original question, in essence, the schools should see some vast change in what happens as a result of that budget being reduced.
Did you want me to say anything, Adrian?
Yeah, Darren, that'd be great, because I know you were party to the discussions last year.
I'm fairly sure that academies pay for this. I remember doing it when I was head at Keddington and converted Keddington in 2013, and this was to pick up things like, there were three core parts. There was the maintenance, annual maintenance survey, the condition survey, and something else, and other elements. And it wasn't something that once the school converted to an academy that you could get directly. We were charged, and I'm pretty sure that Unity we pay for that.
Darren, you're quite correct. There is a sort of charge that property levy. The landlord duty sits on those bigger issues. If there was something massive in terms of structural collapse or something of that nature. But in essence, I think the view of forum was at the previous meeting was that the landlord duty isn't something that we'd continue to commit to. Andrew, do you want to come back on that?
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, that's really useful. In terms of academies, obviously, if we have a major problem, we can apply for an emergency grant. So if you know, there's a major problem with school which affects education, we can do that. I'm not sure whether the local authority can do that, but if you've said to me that it's not going to impact the health and safety in schools, that's answered my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Did you have some other questions, Andrew?
Yeah, is it appropriate for me to ask?
Questions are welcome. As a new, let me make it clear to a new forum member, questions are welcome. That's the point of us coming together.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. The second question relates to the line, which is the Head Teacher Association, and it's reducing significantly, and certainly from a primary perspective. It mentions SASH there, and I don't understand the funding that then goes to SPA, which is the primary Head Teacher Association. But it says that SASH has a healthy reserve, and the importance of SPA to head teachers across Suffolk is vital. The work that's been done to support head teacher wellbeing, to deal with stress levels, to ensure that the local authority are made aware of issues affecting heads on the ground is absolutely vital. So can I just have some explanation of what's being done to continue that, please?
I'm happy to come back on this one, Sonia. You might want to add to it, because I know there were representatives at the meeting. And Andrew, we would, from a local authority perspective, we would echo that view, and also the Heads Association has been both the Primary and Secondary Heads Association have been a really excellent conduit for joint working with the local authority, even before we got to the sort of complexities that we're dealing with COVID. So there are some challenges for us, and indeed I met on Tuesday with representatives from SASH, SPA, and also SEON, because we now have a three-way meeting, which is SASH, a monthly meeting with SASH, with SPA, and with SEON. The history of this that hopefully might shed a bit of light on it is that Madeline Vigar, a number of you remember Madeline, former Suffolk CEO and head teacher, and her SASH executive officer, brought a paper to Forum back in 2016 asking for some support funding for both head teacher associations, and Forum, in my view, rightly were agreeable to that at the time. But there was always the view that it would not necessarily be a long-term funding, because we knew the budget that we were drawing the money from was eventually going to reduce. So the original idea of the, I think, £99,000 that was divided between the two associations was to allow a real establishment and embedding, and exactly the things you describe, Andrew, about the support that the associations both provide to head teachers. And the idea of that funding was that over time that people would see the value of a subscription. And the reason that SASH have got a significant surplus is SASH continued to run on a subscription basis, as well as receiving a grant, in the equivalent of a sort of grant from the local authority. SPA didn't do that, but I believe SPA's intention is to do that. And I met with Jackie, as I say, on Tuesday, and we were talking about how we in the local authority might support in that transition period. What Jackie shared with me was that there were some reserves that meant that SPA would run effectively, certainly till the end of the academic year, and between now and then we would be supporting in terms of communication about how that subscription arrangement could happen. I'd want to just pay tribute to Jackie as the executive officer for SPA, who I think has done an utterly remarkable job in that role. We know that I don't think it's been announced, but there is a replacement. We're delighted that there is a replacement for Jackie, who is moving on to other things, because we would want to continue that close working relationship. And we will support in that transition from there being a block fund to a subscription arrangement. That's hopefully that helps, Andrew, and gives a bit of context.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. I wasn't aware of SPA moving to a funded system as SASH do, but thank you for that, and thank you for your reassurance in regard to that.
Were there any other points you wanted to raise, Andrew, on this paper?
Thank you, Alison. The other points were I think Adrian has covered. We've had a couple of email chats, which all forum members have been copied into. I believe most of the points have been covered. Just in terms of the education and learning grant, it was just about the effectiveness of certain groups and how the funding was being organised. I think the final question I had was in regards to the SLIN, and Adrian sent some details through last night, which were about the number of primaries and secondaries and of those academies that were part of SLIN. And my understanding, I didn't quite understand the wave 1, 2 and 3, whether this was the schools that joined in wave 1 was still part of it, or whether wave 3 was the schools that are now part of it. But it looked like no secondary schools were in wave 3, and I just wondered if that was any concern to the local authority.
Yeah, I'll come back on that. And Andrew, thanks for the question. I mean, SLIN is a really important project to us. And again, just a contextual statement, SLIN was developed between the local authority and the head teacher associations. It's a sort of joint enterprise. You've got to be careful using the term joint enterprise. I suppose that can mean all sorts. But, you know, it was a genuine joint enterprise between the local authority and the close working relationship with SASH and SPAR. Certainly there have been secondaries involved in it, but there are far fewer. I'm just going to check in with Julia Granger, who I know is in the meeting, because Julia will give a little bit more detail and background than me on that. Julia, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you. And yeah, Andrew, thank you for the questions, and Louise too. Really helpful and really important.
Julia, before you start, could you just
oh yes, apologies, Alison.
Meeting, can you just let everybody know your role, please?
Will do. Yeah, thank you. Julia Granger, Head of School Improvement within Education and Learning, Suffolk County Council. So in terms of the schools that signed up for waves 1, 2 and 3 of SLIN, yes, Andrew, you're right. Schools signed up for wave 1. Some of those schools carried on and signed up for wave 3 as well. As Adrian said, SLIN was developed working with the Head Teacher Association, so the Primary Head Teacher Association and SASH, Secondary Head Teacher Association. The numbers of secondary schools that signed up to wave 2 were lower than at wave 1. And when SASH and the secondary school head teachers who were involved evaluated it at the end of the year, they felt that it needed some tweaking to meet secondary head teachers' needs. And so currently wave 3 is completely primary schools, but we continue to work with the secondary head teacher associations to look how it needs to be adapted for secondary schools too. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Julia.
Andrew, have you got anything further that you needed to ask, or have we covered your points now? Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I think my points have been covered by the conversation, by the answers here, or by the information that Adrian sent through to forum members last night. Super.
Thank you very much. Just going back in the meeting chat, I noted there were questions raised by Alison Bowman and Sharon Waldron, one around cladding and one around impact on cost to voluntary aided schools. Sonia, could you take those questions back to property and get a written response for those, please, that we can circulate to forum?
Certainly, will do, Alison.
Lovely, thank you. Right, I know I've got some new messages I need to scroll down to. Let me just see if there's anything else I need to check on here. Super, that was just some comments, so we don't need to check those. Okay, are there any other questions that Andrew, you still got your hand up, by the way. Is there, hang on, I've got another hand up. Let me just go to this screen. Paul Morton, can I invite you to ask your question, please?
Yeah, it's regarding education and learning, and that's looking at the paper. Obviously, the funding has transferred from last year to this year and kept the same as seen as though that's necessary. And the impact statement of what would happen if we didn't agree that paints a fairly pessimistic picture of what support schools would have. But I just wonder if there's been any thought for the following year, if this funding is still going to decrease, whereby schools could be encouraged more to support each other, and as the SLIN, as well as the collaborative work, but actually in a far more effective way and what could be more cost effective and actually better for the schools. Out of the 204 schools that responded on that paper, I'm guessing, seeing as most of those are LA schools, they would be primary schools because just about all the secondaries are now academies. And if you're, for instance, going to take 500,000 of that 1.3 million and pass it round those schools, that's the equivalent of 2,500 roughly per school. That's 10 days of head teacher time could be paid for to support amongst small groups of schools. And in my experience of being a head for 20 years, and this is not to denigrate in any shape or form the advisory services as it is, or the support network from the LA, that's often very effective. And rather than a short-term time, it could be whole days of groups of heads supporting each other. It would need to be looked at of being done in a more rigorous way, in a more higher expectation way. But I'm just wondering for the future, in future years, if that could be considered or looked at, the plausibility of that may make heads and schools support each other I appreciate the statutory need for the LA to have overall responsibility for that and the quality of education for all pupils in Suffolk. But I think at the moment it'd be a nice thing to do for schools to support each other. I think it needs to be trying to be pushed, certainly for maintained schools, as that's an essential thing they do, rather than just it's nice if you got the time. And for the LA to support that, and generally probably that means financially, and some of that money could be used in that way. I was just asking that question for a future years, not necessarily for this year. It'd be too soon to change that round, but I think that's somewhere that we're kind of lacking in, really pushing schools to make sure that they do for each other.
I'd come back on that if I may. Paul, thank you. Really helpful question, and actually it's quite helpful to have on the radar thinking about future years. I think your description of the value of head teachers supporting head teachers, we absolutely endorse. In fact, that was one of the founding principles of the Suffolk Learning and Improvement Network, because it is heads working with heads. So we certainly want to develop that further. I would recognise, particularly thinking of your sector, that we need to do some further development in the specialist sector and in the AP sector, because I think there's probably less of that happening than is happening in the mainstream sector. So I would endorse much of what you're saying, what you're saying there. I think the elephant in the room and the bigger challenge is that this block of money is going to reduce. And the reality in a year's time, and when we do this debate in October next year, is actually how we manage our statutory duties, how schools manage support for each other when we haven't got this budget. Because as Sonia will attest, we're on a programme that in effect is reducing the historic amount in the Central School Service block for all of those things that are not the DFE have listed as the sort of core statutory arrangements. And our discussions next year, I think, will be how we provide support with considerably less money. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Sonia. I mean, we're giving some thought in education and learning, frankly, about how we'll operate on significantly reduced funding. Sonia, but I'll hand back to you on that one.
No, you're right, Adrian. I think that the issue that we're facing is that this block of funding for the historical commitments that as you mentioned, was added to the DSG block, is reducing by 20% every year, and there's no funding. Once that money's gone, it's gone. If for some reason, let's say Schools Forum wanted to cut all of the money in education learning, that money would only be available as a 1 year. That would all then decrease. So actually our saving would be, we wouldn't have any of that money in 22-23. So what we're trying to do is mitigate that loss, knowing that we've got a 20% loss every year. How can we do that in the best way as a partnership to safeguard the duties that obviously impact on our most vulnerable children? So I don't really think I've got anything else to add after that. Yeah.
Paul, I think Paul wants to come back on that. Paul, do.
Yes, thank you. I think that's my point, Adrian, that in the future, schools, it's about changing the mindset. Schools are going to have to support themselves, whether it be next year or whether it be 2 or 3 years down the line. And I think and to save money just because that money's not going to be there, I also think it's a good thing to do educationally as well. But it's about the LA trying in the short term, when that money might still be around or not be, to change that mindset that it's not just a nice thing to do, it's an essential thing to do. It's part of the heads' jobs within their schools, certainly within maintained schools, almost an expectation from Suffolk as a maintained school, so that in future years, that's what they do, as opposed to, oh, this is nice if I've got the time. Which I'm not saying that's what Slim works in that way, but it's not an essential thing. And I think there needs to be that change of mindset that that's how we're going to support ourselves in schools in the future, because we cannot rely, whether it be good support or bad support or indifferent support from the LA in the same way as it has been over the past 10 years, for instance, something like that.
Paul, we're absolutely on the same page as you, and the school improvement strategy that we were in the process of updating in the light, before COVID came along and occupied our time. But the school improvement strategy, the Raising the Bar school improvement strategy that I know a number of forum members will be familiar with, central to that strategy is how we move to a self-supporting system. SLIN is only one dimension of that. Lots and lots of other work that's going on, and we're really happy to have a conversation with you outside of the meeting, or anybody, about projects and activities where we can support a self-supporting system in Suffolk. So we're very much up for that.
I think on the whole, I'm conscious of time, that a lot of this conversation now does need to be taken away from this particular meeting, because we need to focus on the decision about the funding in hand today. But I can see, Andrew, you've got your hand up again. Can I just come to you first before we move on to the recommendations? Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. It was more of a comment about how the report is produced in future years, if that is possible, to compartmentalise it even more, because the statutory responsibilities on the local authority are significant, and to get a perspective on how much is spent on the high level support from this grant and how much is spent on activities such as SLIN, I think would be useful to forum members. That's just a comment about the report itself.
Thank you very much. We'll note that and consider that for next year. Thank you. Sonia, would you now like to go to the recommendations and just give any summary about the recommendations that you want to make before I ask Kylie to put the first question up in the message box?
Okay, no problem. So as I said earlier, we have to do this in two different parts. So initially, the first recommendation is to agree the CSSB savings for 21-22. Which is the result of the work of the Schools Forum subgroup, to enable us to set a balanced budget. If we could do that vote first, and then depending on whether that gets agreed or not, that will then lead to the next vote, which is on actually agreeing the remaining services to be funded from the historical commitments element of the CSSB.
Super, thank you. Okay. Would you like to put the first question into the message box then? Thank you, Kylie. So everybody, if you can click on the link that is now appearing in the message box and vote however you wish. So click on the link and vote, please, now. Well, given how long it's just taken me to do it, I'm assuming that most other people should by now have been able to vote. Thank you, Kylie. You're refreshing the screen. The link is in the message box above the one that you're looking at, Julia. Have you found the vote, Julia?
Apologies, no, it doesn't seem to appear in my chat. Give me a moment.
It's also a link from the email that Teresa sent out with the agenda for today's papers. So there's a, but I don't know. Kylie will have to confirm if that link will work as well. Kylie.
That will be Teresa answer, I'm afraid, Alison.
Oh, sorry. Okay. But
would you like me to repost the link?
Is there anybody else besides Julia who hasn't been able to vote, or has everybody else been able to vote? Oh, you've done the link from the email now, Julia. Fantastic. Okay, everybody has now voted. And I've got it on my small screen, not my big screen, so I can't actually see the numbers. Hang on. Which is not very easy. Okay, so just so everybody who's listening in, it's 21 votes for, no votes against, no abstentions. Okay, so thank you, Kylie. We can move on to the second question now then, please. So there'll now be a new link in the message in the meeting chat There we go. So could everybody now vote again, please? Sorry, Teresa, you're doing that bit. Okay, I'll just give everybody else a moment to vote. Kylie, I think you can probably do a refresh now. Thank you. So there's a few more people who haven't voted yet. Anybody else who wishes to vote? Okay, everybody hasn't voted yet. I'll give you a brief amount more time. So for this vote, we have 19 votes for, none against and no abstentions. Thank you. So both of those recommendations from paper B have been approved by Forum today. Thank you.
Sorry, Alison, we have to agree each individual line. So that's just was the virtual schools. We now have to do education, learning and early help. So there's still some more votes.
There are. Yes, so that covers off number 1 on the paper. So we're now moving on to the elements covered by recommendation 2 in the paper. So Teresa, could you put the next link up, please? Thank you. The link is now there. So if everybody could now vote, please. Okay, Kylie, I'll leave it to you when you're ready to do a refresh to see how many people have voted so far. Thank you. So at the moment we have 18 votes for, none against and no abstentions. Thank you. Is that everybody who wishes to vote for this one? We'll do one more refresh. 19, so we're now 19 for, none against, no abstentions. Thank you very much. Okay, Teresa, we'll move on to the next one, please. So this is the early help question. So if you can please now respond about funding for early help. Anybody else wish to vote for the early help question? Okay, so we have 18 for, none against and no abstentions. Thank you. Okay, Teresa. So now we're up to question 5, which relates to SEND school support services. So if people could now click that link and vote, please. Thank you. So we have 19 votes for, none against and no abstentions. Thank you very much. I think that does now conclude the votes for paper B. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Sonia. So we now go back to the agenda. And we're moving on to paper C now, which is the approval of...
Sorry, Alison, can I just stop? Is there not one more, Teresa? Is there the redundancies? Is that in there?
No, I believe it's just the 5 papers we've got there.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
I looked at the email, so I thought I was on top of it.
Sorry, Alison.
That's all right. Okay, super. Right, so we're now moving on to paper C, which is about de-delegated budgets. So again, this time we will have voting, but the only people who will be eligible to vote on the de-delegated budgets are members of maintained schools. But as with other items on Schools Forum, we always welcome a conversation with all members of the Schools Forum before we get to the voting process. And I'm going to hand over to Adrian to do an introduction to this paper, please.
Thanks, Alison. Yes, colleagues, de-delegation, it's that aspect of the budget. Hopefully people have had a chance to read the paper. Essentially, it's those things that that the local authority can do centrally for maintained schools. There's a number of recurring items. We've put a rationale for each of those within the paper, and we also have some colleagues present from other services who can respond to some of these. And I can't not say that I'm delighted that one of the commentators on one of the papers is Colin Turner, a former member of Forum. You can't keep a good person away, and Colin will be available with Paul Widdowson to pick up the union related item there. But in essence, the paper sets out the arrangements for centralising a number of situations. We have a slightly unusual circumstance this year at Forum, and it's one of the things that I'll pick up in January. But we haven't got secondary representation. There isn't actually a requirement for secondary representation, and with Helen Wilson stepping down, we've got to look at how secondary can give their views on the de-delegation. And when I say secondary, I mean the 4 maintained secondary schools. So we're doing that outside of the meeting. So within the meeting, the voting will be specifically for primary. But I did just want to flag up to Forum that sort of challenge that we've got, that we haven't got secondary maintained representation. So I'm just going to hand over, I've given a bit of context there. I'll hand over to Sonia if there's anything technical on the paper that you want to share.
Thanks, Adrian. So just to confirm, usually we present the CSSB and the de-delegated papers at separate forums, just because in the past there's been some misunderstandings of the differences, as Adrian mentioned earlier, the fact that the de-delegated is a specific request to pass monies back that have been allocated to schools through the national funding formula for services to be provided centrally by the local authority, rather than the CSSB, which is that separate pot of money. So this is only available to the maintained sector. Academies have the option to purchase these services separately from their individual school budget. The reason why these papers have both come together this time is obviously because we had to cancel the last Schools Forum. The recommendation is that the same per pupil level of funding is continued as per last year, and from an LA perspective, the overall pot diminishes as schools convert to academy status and are no longer able to de-delegate funding in this way. As Adrian said, the voting is required by phase, and each service voted on separately, and the relevant services have provided a description of the service that is provided through those de-delegated funds centrally, and so again are available if you've got any specific questions on the services that they provided or is provided from that monies. I think that's really all I've got to say on that. Alison?
Okay, thank you very much. I'll now open it to everyone. If you've got any points you'd like to make or any questions you'd like to raise, please. Stunned into silence. If you've got all the information you need within the paper and you don't need to raise any questions, that's what I'm taking from the lack of questions coming forward. So is everybody happy that we move straight into the voting process? Okay, right, over to you then, Teresa. Let's go with the first link. So the first question is whether we agree with the de-delegation of funding back to the LA for intervention funding, remembering it is only primary maintained representatives who can vote on this topic. Thank you. So we've had 5 votes for, none against and no abstentions. Thank you very much. Teresa, can we have the second question, please? So this one relates to the County Inclusive Support Service. So if we can now vote on that one, please. Thank you, Kylie. So we have again had 5 votes for, none against and no abstentions. Thank you. Okay, question 3, thank you. Thanks, Teresa. This one is about support to underperforming ethnic groups and bilingual learners. Thank you. So again, we have 5 votes for, none against and no abstentions. So Teresa, if we could have the 4th question, please. This one is about funding for the trade unions. This time we have 4 votes for, none against and 1 abstention. Thank you. So that concludes the voting for de-delegation. Thank you very much. Okay. So we have now concluded all of our voting on CSSB and de-delegation. So now we'll move on to paper D, which is about schools block funding formula for 2021-22. And I'm handing over to Mike this time, please. Mike, over to you.
Morning, everybody. So this paper just provides a brief update on the schools block funding formula for 21-22. The good thing about this paper is that there are no proposals for any changes and that the recommendation is that Suffolk Schools Forum to continue to follow the NFF as previously agreed over the past 3 years. A bit of background information for those new to the forum. So about 4 years ago, we as an LA came up with some options about the national funding formula. We could have gone down the sort of the local route and we could have still had lots of local factors, or go down the national funding formula route. The forum at that point in time were unanimous in their decisions that we should follow the NFF, and you know, had some real sort of good advantages. So the one thing was that all LAs will be on the NFF eventually. Just later in the report, we still don't know when the NFF will be fully implemented as yet, and it's been delayed again because of the COVID pandemic. So we still don't know when all LAs within the country will be on the national funding formula. Forum agreed that it would be fair, it'd be transparent, and there would be consistency to the funding for all of our schools in Suffolk. It would reduce the local complexities, so it would reduce all of the all of the formula factors that we potentially could have used if we went down the route of having all of these sort of specific things which benefited some schools. And also it reduces the turbulence for all of the schools in Suffolk. So hopefully over the past 3 years, you would have seen that your budget is fairly stable. There's not many changes that happen on year. So that's why Schools Forum agreed back in 2018-19 that Suffolk should follow the national funding formula. Suffolk continue to see welcome increases in our overall dedicated schools grant allocation. So for next year, based on the information that we do have, that's looking at 466.7 million, although that's likely to change with updated census information from October this year. When we say it's a welcome increase, we still recognise that we are funded fairly lowly in respect to all of the other local authorities. And as we said sort of pre-meeting, that Mary, Alan and Adrian are very active in the F40 group and continue to lobby for Suffolk to ensure that we get the funding that we think that we deserve. So a few key changes in 21-22. So the first one is the teacher pension and pay grants, which had previously been paid separate from the DSG. These have now been included within the DSG funding settlement for 21-22. And all that the DfE have done are just added in sort of the amounts that are currently paid over to schools into the basic entitlement. So you can see on table 2 how much is being added for the primary teacher pay grants, the employer pension grants, and for secondary as well. We were quite surprised that this was just being sort of added into the basic entitlement. We thought it might be a separate line on the schools block allocation, so schools could sort of easily identify how much is being allocated to this. But I'm sure we can do something, or we can add in something in the commentary when we send it out next year to help schools sort of identify that funding. The Income Deprivation Affecting Children Index, or ADACHI as we like to call it, is also changing slightly. So all that the DfE are doing is updating the information that they hold from 2015 to 2019 data. I don't think there's going to be many sort of changes to the funding in this area for schools, not like when the DfE changed from ACORN to ADACHI sort of 6 or 7 years ago, where there was quite a lot of turbulence in the sort of the deprivation funding. The only thing to look out for here for schools is where there's been new housing, which has been sort of built in areas, because that might have an impact on the deprivation funding. So just keep an eye out for that. Sparsity funding. So again, welcome news for those sort of rural schools that the lump sum for sparsity is increasing. So at the moment, we don't know the data. We don't know what schools are eligible. But that's just good news, and we welcome that increase in sparsity funding for Suffolk. And then the minimum per pupil funding has also increased, which we did mention last year. So you can see the values in paragraph 13 there. Then on top of that, the pension and pay grants have been added to the minimum per pupil funding levels. So what the minimum per pupil funding levels means is that any school that falls below this on a per pupil basis is then propped up, so that all schools are funded on exactly the same basis. So, that's the good thing about the national funding formula, that all schools are funded in exactly the same way for their phase. The one thing we just need to keep an eye on, obviously, for Suffolk is that the amount of money that goes into this minimum per pupil funding element. So being a low funded authority, it means that more money tends to go into that to prop up those schools that are not reaching those thresholds. So based on the Annex A, the first pro forma that's in there, there would be about 4.6 million, which would be needed to prop up some of our schools. And I should have included in here just on Annex B, which refers to the 0.5% transfer, which will be discussed in the next paper. We would be looking at about 6 million to prop up the schools as well. So no schools lose out. It's just the amount of money that goes into that factor to help support those schools. So the authority performer tool needs to be submitted this year on the 21st of January. So we'll need sign off by Mary for that. Annex A, as I said, just looks at the funding based on all of the national funding formula unit values. without the 0.5 transfer, and then Annex B, which links into the next paper, just shows what the APT would look like with the 0.5% transfer. Hopefully you've all read the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Mike, very much. Has anybody got any points to raise or any questions they'd like to ask about our formula proposals? Deathly silence. Some of us have been on forum long enough to remember when there were 32 funding formula factors for Suffolk. So this conversation would have gone on a lot longer at those meetings. Karen, I see you've got your hand up. Would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question, please?
Yeah, Karen Mills, head teacher of Ravenswood School. This is my day off, so apologies, I'm at home. Yeah, the question, I get a little bit uncomfortable around how this is accounted for. So we're given the large numbers, but as a school, sometimes money doesn't get lost. But as you said, with the teacher pension grant now going centrally, and hopefully you'll be able to give us some commentary around that. As a school, I welcome that because I can then identify how much money is coming in respect of that. But yeah, when it does get kind of lost, because I've had some issues around free school meals and universal infant free school meals, it's really difficult to try and track what is coming in for specific areas. So I just think, is there some kind of, I know you give us the overall figure, but is it impossible to know what individual figures for schools actually are?
In what sense do you mean?
If I was to say, well, how much money do I get for my teacher's pension? You're saying that could be identified, there'd be a separate commentary. Yeah. There's quite a lot of central funding that if I said to you, well, okay, how much have I received for my free school meals? Could I be told? Would you know that kind of information? Because when we're trying to follow threads for specific reasons, it's actually quite difficult to do that, because I'm just told that it's lumped into the delegated budget, you know, the huge whatever amount I get. And it's difficult when you're trying to really drill down as to what's coming in sometimes. Is that information that is held by the local authority? And as budgets get tighter, I think schools are going to want to know what monies are coming in so they can get their costs in line.
We split out, so on the toolkits that go out to the LA maintained schools, we do split out all of the unit values within the schools block, so that's there, and similarly with the GAG that goes out to academies, so it's all split out. Okay. The factors used in the schools block are proxy measures, so it's just a way of distributing funding to schools based on the pupil characteristics. So when we say look at your deprivation funding as a whole, it might be that you don't need all of that deprivation funding for the pupils in your school, whereas other schools might actually not get enough funding through that proxy measure and need to allocate more funding for pupils from you know, who are from deprived areas. So it's difficult. What we do advise to schools, it's up to you on how you spend your money and you know, and how you allocate that to the various you know, pupil characteristics you have in your school. So it's not something we can split out and say this is how much you should be spending for those cohort of pupils, but it is listed in there just as a guide.
So it's not done specifically. So I've got this number of something which will attract this amount of funding. You're making decisions. Generally, it's more of a global thing.
It is, and that, again, we're directed by the DfE on this, and we follow the national funding formula. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thank you ever so much. Thanks,
Karen. Are there any other points or any other questions? No. Okay. So we now have to agree whether we are happy to continue to follow the national funding formula as our funding formula, as it were, to be used in 2021-22. So Teresa has now put the question in the box for us to click on whether we wish to follow the national funding formula as agreed in previous years. So if you could all vote now, everybody can vote on this one, please. Just give you all a bit longer to vote, so it's everybody can vote on this one. Thank you. had 15 so far. There's a few to go. Okay, so we have 18 votes for, none against and no abstentions. Thank you very much. So we will continue to use the national funding formula as our method of allocating our funding to schools. Thanks very much, Mike. Thanks, everybody. Okay, we can take a breath, everybody. We now have a short break factored in before we move on to the high needs block paper. We have 10 minutes on the agenda, so if everybody could be back just before 11, so a couple of minutes before 11, that would be great, and we'll try and start as promptly as we can at about 2 minutes to 11. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had time to go and get the beverage of your choice. So I hope everybody is back and with us. I'm making the assumption that you all are. And so now we are moving on to paper E, which is about the strategy for reducing the cumulative deficit within the high needs block. And I'm going to hand over to Judith Mobbs to introduce the paper. Thank you, Judith.
Many thanks, Alison. So I just want to start off by providing a little bit of context for this paper before we go into the decisions it sets out. So I think the first thing that we need to all bear in mind is that Suffolk is and has been substantially underfunded in recent years in terms of its high need block. And that's something Adrian's already raised this morning in terms of the overall funding for Suffolk schools. So this will not be a surprise to you. But I just want to remind you of the levels of underfunding that we have been dealing with within the high needs block. So in the current year, we are about £3.5 million less well funded than the average authority in the country, than the rest of the LAs in the east of England, and indeed compared with our statistical neighbours. The previous year, that figure would have been about £6.5 million. So these are substantial figures that make a massive difference to our situation. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that other LAs nationally are struggling on higher levels of funding than Suffolk has, where they have got the median or higher funding, and they are still struggling in terms of meeting their obligations around special educational needs. So on the one hand, Suffolk has this low level of funding. On the other hand, we, like everywhere else, are seeing an increasing level of demand. In recent years, demand has escalated, and I know those of you that are in schools will be seeing this yourself. You'll be seeing the changes in the pupil population who are coming forward to you. And a current illustration of this would be the 550 new requests for high needs funding we've received this autumn term. So I'll just remind you that if children already have a high needs funded banding, there isn't a need to make a request. So these are new requests to us this autumn. And this pattern is being repeated year on year. The consequent impact of this systemic underfunding and the continuing significant rises in demand for services for children with SEND is a £13 million cumulative deficit for Suffolk in recent years in the high needs block. In the current year, that deficit will be about £3 million. In the previous year, it was about £6 million. And I think it's really interesting to note that actually these deficit levels are at the same level as the underfunding, or roughly speaking, the underfunding, just slightly less. So it's interesting to reflect that if we were funded at the national median position, we would actually be managing within our means, something which actually many other local authorities are not managing to do. And I think this is because over the last 4 years, we have put in place some very tight cost management arrangements. We've put in place a very consistent arrangement around funding. And we have worked really hard to ensure that there is a transparent system in place to ensure that it is fair and equitable in the way that we are funded. We know that nationally, SEND funding is a big discussion point, and there is a national SEND review, which inevitably has been delayed due to the pandemic. We hope that there will be long-term change in relation to the inequity of the funding. Having said that, in the meantime, we've got to manage this situation within our means. And as you'll have read in the paper, we have to develop a recovery plan for our high needs block deficit and have to find a way forward. So really, there are only two options open to us. The first one is that we look at a rebalancing of funds, at least on a temporary basis, between the blocks within the DSG. So obviously a transfer potentially from the schools block to the high needs block. That's one option open to us. The alternative option open to us would be to reduce the top-up rates for pupils who are receiving high needs funding. So there's been substantial work done on this by officers and indeed the High Needs Working Group, which is a subgroup of the Schools Forum, and they've looked at both options and have done considerable work on the paper that you see today. I have to say to you that while both of these options are challenging, and I recognise the fact that neither is particularly palatable, I think one potentially offers us a more equitable solution than the other. So if we think about the schools block, if we were to go down that route to actually release funds to support a recovery plan, at least we'd be in a position where every setting would be making an equal contribution to supporting our most vulnerable children and young people, regardless of their context, regardless of the level of children with special educational needs in their schools. It would mean that our schools that are the most inclusive would be being supported through this route. Those that have the highest level of SEN and those also that have stepped up to the plate and offered new specialist units as part of our development would be supported through that route. Conversely, if we go with the high needs top up as a way of and reducing that as a way of actually securing the funding we need to balance the deficit, we would be penalising disproportionately those schools who have the highest levels of children who have specialist needs in them. We would be penalising those schools who have specialist units, disproportionately affecting pupils with special educational needs. So for me, that decision is an equity issue. I think we also need to bear in mind that our specialist settings, our specialist schools and our units are already facing a real terms reduction in their funding, because unlike the schools block, the funding per place for pupils in the high needs block has not increased since we set the top-up rates 3 years ago. So we've had a 3 years real terms decline for funding for our specialist settings, and that, even if we maintain the top-up rates at their current level, is expected to continue. So I would commend to you that we have to take the difficult decision to take this funding from the schools block on the grounds of equity and fairness and supporting our most vulnerable learners. So if we move on then to thinking about how much funding we need to take and for how long, there are two options before you this morning. The first one is to take 0.35% and the second one to take 0.5%. We're proposing, and this is something we've discussed at length with the High Needs Working Group, that the recovery plan should be achieved over 5 years. We looked at 3, 5 and 7 years as the options. 3 years is too quick for us and would have significant shocks in the system. 5 years is a manageable period that we believe would be acceptable and the longest acceptable period to the DFE in terms of the recovery plan. And 7 years would be very unlikely to be acceptable to the DFE, and therefore if we went down that route and recommended that to you, it's very unlikely that we would get a plan that would be agreeable. So I guess the second point I commend to you is that we're proposing a 5-year recovery plan. And then finally, thinking about those proportions and how much that transfer should be from the schools block to the high needs block. There's two considerations here to think about. The first one is we've got to pay down the deficit. But in addition to paying down the deficit, we've got to be mindful of demand escalation going forward. And therefore, our proposition is also that we create a demand cushion. If we go for 0.35% per annum transfer from the block, that would enable us to pay down the deficit. However, as it sets out at paragraph 55, by year 3, if demand continues to grow at the current rate, we would have no funding left to meet that additional demand, and we would be back into deficit. And that does not seem a very responsible way for us as a forum to respond if we're thinking about planning for the future and being prudent in considering future eventualities. If we go for 0.5%, that does create a reasonable demand cushion. It does also allow, at some future point, if Forum wished, a consideration of whether it would be appropriate for an inflationary increase in the top-up rates sometime in the next 5 years. And I'd just like to remind you of the point I made earlier that, we are facing a real term reduction in those rates currently, and that will continue unless Forum reaches that decision at some point. But I would emphasise I'm not suggesting that immediately, and I think that's a future decision for Forum in probably a couple of years' time. So, therefore, in summary, I'm commending to Forum a commitment to a decision to a recovery plan over 5 years, to take the additional funds needed to achieve this from the schools block over that 5-year period, and to suggest that the level of transfer per annum should be 0.5%. Now, I do realise that's a big ask, and I realise that's a long-term commitment. What we're trying to do here is to set out a really clear strategy. But I recognise that Forum will want an annual report on that, and that's absolutely right and proper, and we would want to come back and report on progress against that and against the recovery plan. And I would say that if things are going more smoothly than we expect, so if demand is lower, or indeed if the SEN national review suggests that funding will come to Suffolk at a higher level, then my proposal would be that we would reduce or cease that transfer as and when appropriate. So that's my overview summary of the paper, Chair, and I'll hand back to you for any questions or comments.
Thanks very much, Judith. It's a complex piece of work. I thank you for the way that you've set it out to Forum this morning. I think that's really helpful. Those of us who've been on the high needs group obviously have a much deeper understanding of it all, but I think you've given a really clear explanation of how we can move forward and address the deficit in the way you've described it this morning. There's been a number of comments that have been going through in the message box. Councillor Mary Evans, thank you very much for your offer to take a comment from the Schools Forum to local MPs. Open to what people would like to suggest, but in my mind, I was just thinking that the summary that Judith gave a little while ago about our comparative funding compared to national averages, our statistical partners and the region, if we were to summarise that and said, this in 3 different ways that you can cut the figures, we are underfunded in all 3 ways compared to those comparators. That could be a message that we could ask Mary to take to our MPs, because that is evidence-based. It's not just us saying that we feel we're underfunded, that's all evidence. But is there anything else anybody would like to suggest? My proposal would be, and I'll put you on the spot, Judith, is that we ask Judith, with her knowledge, to write a statement for Mary to be able to take to MPs. Would people agree with that? Is there any other comments anybody would like to make on that aspect before we go back to discussing the different elements of the paper? Mary, I'll come to you. Thank you.
I think that would be an excellent way forward. Thank you. That would be really helpful, because I think Judith summarised the case very well. It wasn't over emotional. It was very factual about how underfunded we are, and I think that sometimes MPs, they get so bombarded, but actually spell it out really clearly, and I would take it to them and argue the case. I'm very happy to do that, because people have got to understand, if we had the correct amount of money, we would be doing.
Oh, you've just frozen on us, Mary. Your connection has gone. We'll come back to you, Mary, if there's anything else you want to add when your connection has reconnected. Is there anybody else who would like to raise points about the proposals in the paper, either the timescales or the amount of contribution, or the route that we take the money from, either from schools block or changing the banding levels? Andrew, I see your hands up. I'll ask it to come to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I just would like some clarification of paragraph 13, where it talks about the indication of additional funding. How does that impact on the reducing of the deficit?
Judith?
Bear with me while
Okay.
I find paragraph 14.
Paragraph 13, I think, wasn't it?
13, I apologise.
Yeah, 13.
Yes, so Andrew, the points made in paragraph 13 are already taken into account in the projection for us to be at 13 million by the end of this year. I would just make the point that these additional sums are for 1 year periods, so we have no certainty about whether they continue, but obviously we would hope that they will. I also would just make the point, rather disappointingly, the DfE provided a headline summary of an additional 9 million for Suffolk, but then immediately, without making it very obvious publicly, identified the need to remove 1.3 million of that for the teacher pay and pension contribution. So, you know, there's an interesting kind of smoke and mirrors game nationally around this. And we would hope, I think it's really interesting to note the kind of increases that Suffolk is achieving at the moment, because that demonstrates how massively we are underfunding compared with the rest.
Thank you, Judith. In terms of the cost, I believe you said it was 0.35, but the 0.5 would give the cushion. Is that correct? So the 0.35 would cover the costs. So is there any mileage in looking at 0.35 and then coming back to Schools Forum for a change if that is needed?
So the paragraph 55 sets out the differing levels of cushion that would be achieved from the 0.35 position, and you can see that in the year 2021-22, actually we need to achieve, that will only give us a cushion of 2.6 million. The cushion isn't very great in that first year, so I wouldn't commend a 0.35 adjustment in year one. It may well be appropriate to pull back from that in year 2 or 3. So I would propose that Forum consider a 0.5 initially. If Forum doesn't feel able to agree a 0.5 for the 5 years, then I would suggest with a review, because I absolutely agree there should be a review. We could look at doing maybe the first couple of years on 0.5 and then perhaps pulling back to 0.3. I think the issue is the additional demand we're seeing, Andrew. So we've seen demand go up by in the current year, we are predicting demand to be 3 million higher in terms of our total high needs funding requirement than it was last year. Now, I mean, obviously we're doing various things to try and control that. The development of the new specialist places is a key element of that, because the cost per place of having those local places is significantly less than if we have to go to the independent sector. But at the moment, we're not managing to, because it's not a standstill position. If we were just dealing with a static pupil population and we were able, therefore, to repatriate those from the independent sector to into our local provision, in most cases, that would be that would enable us to actually reduce the cost per place more quickly. Our challenge is, because of the level of demand, we are filling up specialist places locally at a rate that means we still need to use the same level of independent placements. So I really would commend going for 0.5 initially, even if we do review it back to 0.3, or indeed we might be able to cease it altogether in future years if further funding comes from the national pot.
So just to check, you are suggesting 0.5 for the first year with a review about the continual use of 0.5. Is that correct, Judith?
The proposal in the paper is that Schools Forum agree to a provisional commitment of 0.5 each year for 5 years. Now, the reason I've put that there is twofold. A, we need some clarity beyond a single year for the purposes of the recovery plan. So if we only have a 1 year agreement from Forum, we can't actually write a recovery plan that sets out the general direction of travel over the 5 year period. The second reason is to give some certainty, because I think it's helpful to everybody to have some certainty around planning assumptions. So that for me would be the worst case scenario. But I absolutely would support and recognise that it might be appropriate for Forum to make those decisions subject to an agreement to an annual review. I'm assuming that you would want that, and I would propose that. So we could, write that in as a kind of subsection of the decision. And then clearly, if things are going more favourably than we anticipate, then we would be in a position to either reduce that or at some point in the future cease it. And that would mean actually that schools would end up in their planning assumptions with slightly more money than they would be planning for initially, which feels the right way round to do things to me.
Okay, thank you, Judith. My final question is probably not just for you, it's probably for the politicians amongst us, but it's whether Suffolk, by moving this to cover this deficit, is actually robbing Peter to pay Paul, and may be seen in the political agenda as being able to cope with financial difficulties such as this.
Thanks, Andrew. I think that's duly noted. We've been an underfunded authority for a very long time, and our membership of F40 and efforts to try and raise the profile of being an underfunded authority will continue. But I think that's something we need to bear in mind. But as Judith has said, we need to think about the decision today in terms of the recovery plan that we need to submit to the DFE, and we need to make our decision based on that. Paul, I can see that you've got your hand up. Thank you. Or Judith, did you want to come back in first?
I just wanted to say that I don't believe it will be seen in that light, Andrew, because the position nationally is that no authority is able, or hardly any authority out of the 150 odd is able to cope within their high needs block. It's really clear this is a national position. I think we have already seen some hopeful signs through the higher level of increases we've received compared with other authorities. So although there's still a gap, the gap is closing rather than being maintained. So I don't believe if Forum makes this decision, it will be detrimental to the national changes that are potentially needed. However, of course, alongside making this decision, we would want to continue to lobby at every opportunity. And I've been very grateful that the Suffolk politicians have taken the opportunity to play a really key role through the F40 group in those national negotiations and lobbying.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you both. Paul, I'll hand over to you now. Sorry for the delay.
That's okay, thank you. I'd just like to thank everyone for wanting to save me. That's come up on the chat there. And reiterate Judith's point, I appreciate that mainstream schools will not be overjoyed with the idea of losing 0.5 of their budget for the next 5 years. But I'd just like to put that into context of what special schools and the POOs have been dealing with that stagnation in funding, with no element of inflation change at all over the time span. We've had at least, probably more than a 10% reduction in our budget. So if you take 5% over 5 years, or 2.5, that will still, and our budget is not, as Julie said, not even being looked at to actually increase for at least another couple of years. So that we're cut to the beyond the quick to some degree, and the changing, other than doing it in the wages proposing by changing how a tariff need bandings and things like that, is not really tenable for special schools and POOs. Obviously, I'm going to say that because I'm head of a POO, but we have been having some serious cuts over the past few years because we've not had any changes at all, and it would be very difficult to do it any other way for us at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Point well made. Thank you. Mary, I see in the chat that you had a power cut. You were partway through giving a commitment, thank you, to take the message back to MPs. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, or had you covered everything you wished to?
I think I'd said all that was needed, but it was a bit of a sudden sort of rush out of the meeting that I was unprepared for. But I'm very happy to take that message forward to our MPs.
Super. Thank you, Mary. Thanks very much. Okay, are there any other, I see there's been some points made in the message boxes. I don't know if there's anybody who wanted to say anything about any of those. I don't think there weren't any particular questions as such in those, just agreement for some of the thoughts. Judith, you'd like to come back in, thank you.
I'm conscious that we need to refer to Dawn Carmen Jones's points, which are about this paper and are quite a long way up the chat. So yes, I didn't know, Chair, whether it's appropriate to return to those at this point.
Rather than me trying to scroll all the way back to find them, I'd ask Sonia to come in and put them on Dawn's behalf. Sonia, I don't know if you'd like to do that now, please.
Yeah, I'm just looking through Dawn's comments, and I think a lot of it is actually been covered. Dawn asked that a recovery plan is presented to Forum on an annual basis with progress to date in removing the deficit. That way Forum can see the impact of the percentage reduction of schools block and be confident the recovery plan is being implemented and will provide a balanced surplus position in 5 years' time. I think as part of the DFE expectations with regards to that template that they've asked us to fill in, they're very clear that it has to be signed off not just by Schools Forum but by our Director of Children's Services, Alan Cadzo, and also by our Section 151 officer. The second point that Dawn made was that Forum received confirmation they can sign off a 5-year reduction and whether annual approval is required. And I put in the chat that whatever we agree, as Judith quite rightly said, this is about a 5-year plan that, and as you know, plans can be reviewed, it would have to still be agreed on an annual basis. We can't do an in-year change because the percentages have to be agreed in terms of movements between blocks on the APT, and that has to be agreed by Forum annually. So there would be an annual voting on that anyway. And then Dawn's third point was that should the recovery plan be achieved in a shorter time span as a result in increased external funding, then this reduction in schools block is reversed at an appropriate time, returning to the funds to the mainstream sector. And I think, as Judith said, that would absolutely be, would have a look at what the additional funding is and how that could be used, and that could be reducing the contribution entirely, or as Judith said, it might mean that there'd be capacity to increase bandings or look at other kind of investments, but it all depends on what that future funding is. So it's a really difficult position where we can budget for what our pressures are. However, we're in a position we can't really budget for what our future funding is at the moment beyond next year. So I think they are what that would cover Dawn's points. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks very much, Sonia. Judith, is there anything there that you wish to add to, or has Sonia summarised it enough?
I think Sonia summarised it very well there. I would support the points that Dawn has made. They're very reasonable and appropriate.
Super. Thank you, Judith. Are there any other points that anybody would like to raise before we move on to the voting process, please? I'll take that as a no because nothing's popping up straight away. OK, this time we're handing over to Teresa, who's got the marvellous job of working us through a marvellous decision tree, because depending on how your initial answers go, it will lead to other questions. So I'll hand over to Teresa to pop the first question up for us, please. So the first question is, do we agree that the reduction of the cumulative deficit within the high needs block is recovered over 5 years? Can you please vote on that? Click on the link from the message box, please. We'll just give it a little bit longer for the rest of your votes to come in. Thank you. Thank you. We've got 18 responses in and we have 18 for, no against and no abstentions. Thank you very much. Teresa, I'll let you put the next question up, please. The second question is, do we agree that the funding needed for the recovery and the future demand cushion come from the schools block? Could you please click the link and vote for that, please? Just wait for a few more votes to come in, thank you. Anybody just making their final decision? Because we've got 17 responses this time. Lovely. So we've got 18 votes for, none against and no abstentions. So we've agreed that the deficit will come from the high needs block. Thank you.
Alison, just to say that Julia is having some difficulty with the voting and has sent a message.
Okay, Teresa, I don't know whether you can email Julia with the question and whether she can do it from there. But given that we have 18 for and no against, we will, of course, give Julia the opportunity to vote as well, but it won't make any difference to the result today. If it had been in the balance, then we would have waited for Julia to get an email and reply back. But we'll note that, and in the minutes, we can note the final results of each of these votes. But as we've got 18 for and none against, we'll move on to the next question. Thank you.
Alison, can I just correct, you said earlier that the deficit will come from the high needs block, and what you meant with the schools block?
I did. That's because I was just reading high needs block at the top of that question. I was reading it too quickly. Thank you, Sonia. Yes, we have agreed from the question that the funding will come from the schools block. Yes, just for clarity. Thank you for that, Sonia. So we now move on to question 3 that has now appeared in the meeting chat. Do you agree to a 0.5% transfer per annum from the schools block to the high needs block for the next 5 years to support the recovery of the deficit and build a demand cushion? Bearing in mind what we have also said is that we will regularly review that, but we will make a commitment to 5 years initially. Thank you. So vote on that basis. Thank you. So we've nearly got all the responses in, couple to go. So we've had 18 responses, thank you. We have 18 for, none against and no abstentions, that we will take a 0.5% transfer potentially for the next 5 years. Thank you. Are we there, Teresa? Have we answered all the questions we need to now? I think we have, haven't we? Yes, thank you, Teresa, for confirming. Super. So we have now completed the paper on the strategy for reducing the cumulative deficit. Can I thank you all very much for that? I know it will have an impact on a lot of your schools' budgets, and I'm really pleased to see that everybody thinks in the same way, that it's about doing what's best for all pupils in Suffolk, and that's the way that we voted today. So I think that's really positive. Thank you very much. So we can now move on to paper F, which is about the adoption by Academy Trust of the policy for the recruitment of education funding after the permanent exclusion of a pupil. And I'm going to hand over to Gemma Morgan from the SEND team for this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Good morning, everybody. So this paper that we've brought to you this morning is to talk to you all about the adoption of the policy that we introduced in September 2020. It was introduced following previous discussions that Schools Forum had had and the agreement to introduce this new policy. The new policy is about how we recoup funding following the permanent exclusion of a child. It looks at the transparent way in which we would recoup the money from the excluding school and then passport that to the receiving school, or establishment, whatever service that child moves into once they've been permanently excluded. So we wrote to from a maintained schools point of view, they have started using the policy from September, and we've implemented that across all of our maintained settings. But for our academy trusts, we had to write to them all and ask them to adopt the policy. So we did that. We wrote to them all. We sent a copy of the policy. We sent some worked examples, and all the information was shared with the academy trusts. Now, as you will have seen from the paper, we had 8 academy trusts who have adopted the policy. We have had 4 who have refused to adopt the policy. And what that means is that we won't be able to recoup funding from them, but they also won't receive funding if they take on a child that has been excluded from another setting. And in total, we've had 24 academy trusts that have not yet made a decision. Some have come back to us and asked some questions, which we've answered. But like I say, there are 24 in total who have either not adopted or rejected the policy. So what we have done is we've written again to all those academy trusts. I mean, we have given them quite a few opportunities to adopt the policy, and we've written to them again to say that as we haven't heard from them, we are going to presume that they have adopted the policy, and we will continue to start implementing the policy for all children who have been permanently excluded from September 2020. So the reason we've brought the paper to you is because we wanted to show you which academy trusts have adopted it, which of those haven't, and then ask Forum for any support or advice or suggestion that they could give me and my team into how we get these other academy trusts to adopt the policy. So that, I think that's the paper, Alison, covered in a nutshell. And obviously, like I say, what we really want is some opportunity from Schools Forum to give us some advice on what we should do next.
Thanks very much, Gemma. There's a question in the message box. I don't know if you can see the message box.
Yes, I can. Sorry, I'm just catching up on that.
Pupils within an academy trust.
Those. No, the policy. So, would these academy trusts then be required to keep the PECS children within the trust school? No, not necessarily. If a child is permanently excluded following the various stages of the process, then if they haven't adopted the recruitment policy, that doesn't affect whether that child physically being excluded. It's just about the recoupment. This policy is just about the recoupment of the funding and the receiving of funding if a school accepts or receives a child that's been permanently excluded.
Super. And then there's another question just below that from Darren. Or that was more of a comment, really.
Yeah, did you get the amendments from Tim to confirm the 4 Berry schools that joined in July will move to the adopted group? Oh, thank you, Darren. No, I will move those across because they obviously, that's great. So thank you for that confirmation. But Unity as a whole have adopted the policy, so that's brilliant.
Super, thank you.
Thank you, Alison.
That's okay. And Andrew, you've got your hand up. Would you like to put your point or ask your question now, please?
Thanks, Alison. Yes, just in terms of the response from Tillian, we are one of the schools who have not agreed. But part of that is because I sent an email to Gemma in May and didn't receive a response, which didn't clarify my points. So that's the reason why we have refused at this present time.
Okay, Andrew, well, if I will speak to my team are dealing with the email responses, so I don't believe I've seen that one. So if I'll look into that when after this meeting and have a look into it and then see if we can resolve those issues, Andrew, and maybe then Tillian could adopt the policy, which would be a really good step forward.
Thanks very much, Gemma.
Thanks, Gemma.
Are there any other points anybody would like to make? Or any other suggestions, as Gemma requested, about how to encourage any other schools any other trusts to come forward and adopt the policy? Daniel Jones, hello. You're welcome to ask your question now, please.
Okay, well, it's not a question really, it's just further to the comment I made there. The reason our trust have signed up is because we believe it should be the same rules for every school in Suffolk, and there might be times where we're on one end of this situation, and there'll be times when we'll be on the other end. So I think the best way to approach those trusts that might not have signed up would be just to emphasise that it needs to be one system for all schools.
Thank you very much, Daniel. When we first discussed this at Schools Forum, probably about 2 years ago, that was just the conversation that members of Schools Forum had, that all members of Schools Forum felt that it should be the same process, whatever way a school was managed, whether it's a maintained school or an academy. And it's only been because sadly, not all schools did then respond by making the financial contribution that was expected, that we had to go to the point of having this policy written. So yes, you're absolutely right. I'd agree with you. It should be the same principle wherever the pupil is. It shouldn't matter if they're in an academy or a maintained setting as to whether the funding should follow them. But not everybody seems to see it that way, I'm afraid. There was a question came into the box I saw from Steve Lovett around whether the current version of the policy requires the £2,000 payment pro rata. Is that still the same, Gemma, or has that changed?
No, so there was the previous policy, there was a £2,000 that was taken as almost like a fee. That doesn't exist within the policy anymore. The only place it does exist is where a school is excluding very close to the end of the academic year. And that's when the prorated amount is too small to follow the child to a new setting, and then we do put in a higher amount. But it's not. It only comes into play when the prorated amount is less than £2,000. So it's not above the prorated amount, as Steve has asked in the question.
And then there's another question from Jill around if a maintained school takes a child from a trust who hadn't signed up, what the situation would be.
So as Jill's put there, if a maintained school takes a child from a trust who hasn't signed up, there is no funding. We can't recoup the funding from the academy, so therefore we can't passport it to the receiving school. So unfortunately, no, there would be no funding.
Andrew, is that a new hand or an old hand, please?
Hi, Alison. Yeah, this is a new hand. Gemma, in terms of getting trusts on board, have you considered coming to Sion and talking just for a 10-minute period at Sion?
No, I hadn't, but I absolutely could do that.
Okay, if you ping me an email, I'll sort it out for you.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You might see a request from Sue Prickett for a copy of the policy.
Yep, and Steve has asked where we can find the current policy. It is going to be published on the Suffolk Learning website. It hasn't been for some reason. It should have been, but I will chase that up. But I can send a copy of the policy to anybody who needs it. So that's absolutely fine.
Shall I suggest that you send it to Teresa and she can send it to all forum members so everybody's got a copy to hand if they want it and can pass it on to anybody else they wish to as well?
That would be really helpful. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you. Let me just check. Andrew, is that another new hand? No, lovely. Okay, are there any other? Oh, I can see the comments box has just clicked again when I've gone to hands up. Okay, Jill is asking that it be made clear to maintain schools because it might impact on the decision to take a child.
No, I do appreciate that. I mean, obviously, we wouldn't want a child to be taken, the consideration for a child to be taken down, whether a child's taken on or not is purely down to funding. We will have we may have some additional funding that we can make available, because obviously if a child leaves one setting that has signed up to the policy and then goes into another one that hasn't, then we will have some funding available. However, I don't know what level that will be at this point. But no, as it stands, as Gillian says, there will be no funding if a child comes from an excluding school that hasn't adopted the policy.
Thank you. Judith, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alison. The point that perhaps hasn't been covered in all of this is how Forum feel about us assuming that trusts that have not responded are silent on the matter are therefore accepting of the policy. Because, you know, we've written to trust 3 times now. Now, I do realise it's in a period of pandemic and therefore, but people, you know, have got other things on their mind. But it feels like it's reasonable to expect a response on that basis. So I just would be very interested in any forum members who've got any advice or views on that, or maybe we should do that after we've been to Sion.
Thanks, Judith. Sue Prickett has asked the question, has this policy been partially adopted already? Is it being implemented? Gemma, would you just...
So the policy was implemented from September. We wait till the off-roll dates come through following permanent exclusions. We had the first one last week. So the process is starting to be followed. My team undertake the internal funding calculations, and then they will share that with the excluding school. We're trying to be really transparent about how we recoup the funding. So we include breakdowns of all of the costs that we've used, the percentages that we've used to come up with the amounts that we're recouping. So that's the process. Very early days, because we like to say the first one was last week. So we are working through the process, and like I say, being as transparent with the excluding schools as we can be. Alison, you're on mute.
There I go. Steve has added a question in the messages about Thomas Mills High School not appearing on the list. Have the SATs been contacted, is his question.
I'll have to double check that. I will make a note of Thomas Mills High School, but thank you, Steve. I'd not noticed that they were missing.
Okay, I think, thank you, Andrew, for the offer for Gemma to be able to go to Sion to have a conversation about this. I think that's really helpful. So unless anybody's got any other comments to make on this paper at the moment, as it was for information, we'll move on. And we'll note for Gemma the question about St Edmundbury and Ipswich Diocesan Mat as well, that Gemma can follow up. Thank you, Sharon. OK, thank you very much. So we now move on to the forward plan for our January meeting. The items that we already have for that meeting are the 2021-22 schools block funding formula. We've got the a particular item on early years challenges and sufficiency, recognising that we have early years representation on Schools Forum, and because of the type of papers we've had a lot of recently, we haven't actually revisited the particular needs of early years recently, so we wish to have a discussion about that at the next meeting. A conversation about as was being discussed before this meeting started, the particular budget challenges and deficits in terms of what's been happening to do with the pandemic response, and also about lobbying DfE for support for schools with pandemic costs, which again have been highlighted outside of the agenda items for this meeting as well. If there's anything else in particular that anybody feels that they would like to propose as any future agenda items, we're always happy for proposals to come forward. If there's any particular financial issues that you don't think we're covering at Schools Forum that we need to look at, then please feel free to contact us about that. And at the bottom of the agenda, we've got the dates of future meetings for 2021 that you can all note for your diaries. Thank you very much. Is there any final points that anybody wishes to make before I close the meeting today? I will give you 30 seconds and that's it, to put your hands up very quickly. Super. It's been quite a complicated meeting today. We've had a lot of decisions to make on different topics. I really appreciate all of the questions, the input and the consideration that everybody has given to the different topics that we've covered today. And thanks in particular to those officers who've had to put the papers together and explain all of these topics to us to help us review and think about what decisions we wanted to make. So thank you all very much and see you in January. I'll now close the meeting. Thank you.